You have arrived here perhaps because something in your chest has cracked open, perhaps because the word heartbreak has stirred something ancient within you that you cannot name. If you have, then know this: we do not gather merely to speak of romance gone wrong or the sentimental poetry of love lost. No, we are gathered here to examine the most sophisticated psychological programming ever devised by nature itself, a system so intricate and so merciless that it can reduce the strongest among us to trembling children in a matter of moments. When I speak of heartbreak, I do not speak of the shallow disappointment that follows a casual rejection. I speak of the systematic rewiring of consciousness itself, the moment when love reveals its darkest secret, that it was never meant to be a blessing alone, but a form of existential conditioning so profound that it alters the very architecture of your mind. And that alteration, once complete, becomes a prison whose bars are made not of steel, but of memory. The heart, as we have been taught to understand it, is not the gentle organ of affection that poets celebrate. It is a recording device, a biological hard drive that stores every moment of connection with photographic precision. When love enters your life, it does not simply bring joy. It begins an installation process, downloading its patterns into your neural pathways, your hormonal systems, your very sense of identity. You become a living shrine to another person's presence, and when that presence is withdrawn, the shrine does not simply empty, it becomes a mausoleum. But here is what the modern mind refuses to acknowledge. Heartbreak is not an accident of love. It is love's intended function. The programming begins from the first moment of attachment, laying the groundwork for its own destruction. Like a virus that builds its replication system while appearing to heal, love embeds itself so deeply in your psychological architecture that its removal becomes an act of self-mutilation. In one of my most haunting encounters with this phenomenon, I worked with a woman who had not slept properly in 8 months. She would lie awake each night, her body rigid with a pain she could not locate, as if every cell remembered something her conscious mind was trying to forget. Her lover had left on a Tuesday morning, taking nothing but a single suitcase, and yet she described feeling as though her organs had been rearranged. That is not metaphor. That is the literal truth of how love programs the body to suffer. She brought me a dream that revealed the mechanism of her torment. In the dream, she stood in a vast library where every book contained a memory of their relationship. But as she opened each book, the words began to bleed off the pages, staining her hands, her clothes, her skin. She tried to close the books, but they would not shut. She tried to leave the library, but found the doors had vanished. The books multiplied around her, each one hemorrhaging its contents until she was drowning in a sea of liquid memory. This dream, I told her, was not symbolic, it was diagnostic. Her unconscious was showing her the truth that her rational mind could not accept. Love had transformed her into a living archive of another person's existence, and now that person's absence was causing the archive to consume itself. Every happy memory had become a weapon turned inward. Every moment of connection, now a source of disconnection so profound, it threatened her sense of reality itself. You see, the brain cannot distinguish between the loss of love and the threat of death. When attachment is severed, the same neural pathways that govern survival begin firing in patterns of desperate alarm. Your body floods with stress hormones, your sleep cycles collapse, your appetite disappears or becomes compulsive. You are not being dramatic when you say that heartbreak feels like dying. You are being neurologically accurate. But the programming runs deeper than mere chemistry. Love, in its most consuming form, operates through what I have come to understand as identity fusion. You do not simply love another person, you begin to exist through them. Your sense of self becomes dependent on their reflection, your emotional regulation tied to their presence, your future constructed around their participation. When they leave, they do not simply take their love with them, they take the version of yourself that existed in relationship to them. There is a story I encountered in my research, drawn from the case files of a colleague who specialized in what he called attachment dissolution. A man in his 40s, successful by every external measure, came to him speaking of what he described as phantom limb syndrome of the soul. His partner of 12 years had ended their relationship, and he found himself reaching for her in sleep, speaking to empty rooms as if she were still there, setting 2 plates at dinner from pure unconscious habit. But the most disturbing symptom was this: he had begun to forget who he was before her. 12 years of shared identity had overwritten his individual psychological patterns so completely that he could no longer access memories of his independent self. He would stand in his own apartment, surrounded by possessions he had chosen, and feel like a stranger in his own life. Love had not simply broken his heart, it had dissolved the boundaries of his selfhood so thoroughly that her absence left him with an identity crisis that bordered on dissociation. This is the true horror of how love programs the mind. It convinces you that connection equals survival, that another person's presence is necessary for your continued existence. And because this programming operates below the level of conscious thought, you cannot simply reason your way out of it. The body believes what the body believes, and the body believes that love lost equals death approaching. The withdrawal symptoms of love resemble nothing so much as the detoxification process of addiction, and this comparison is not accidental. Love triggers the same reward pathways as cocaine, floods the system with the same neurochemicals as gambling, creates the same patterns of tolerance and dependence as any substance known to alter consciousness. When the supply is cut off, the brain goes into withdrawal, generating cravings so intense they can drive otherwise rational people to behaviors that would horrify their normal selves. I have seen heartbroken individuals become stalkers, not from malice but from genuine neurochemical desperation. I have watched them make choices that destroy their careers, their friendships, their reputations, all in service of alleviating withdrawal symptoms they do not understand. They are not weak or pathetic, they are experiencing the programmed response of a system designed by evolution to ensure pair bonding at any cost. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of love's programming is how it weaponizes hope. Even in the depths of heartbreak, even when all rational evidence suggests the relationship is over, the mind continues to generate scenarios of reconciliation. You find yourself interpreting neutral interactions as signs of renewed interest, reading hidden meanings into casual text messages, constructing elaborate fantasies about how your former lover might return. This is not delusion. This is the program running its course. Love embeds itself so deeply in the predictive mechanisms of the brain that it continues generating expectations of reunion long after the relationship has ended. Your unconscious refuses to accept that the source of your identity has been permanently removed, so it keeps producing hope like a broken machine that cannot stop manufacturing a product for which there is no longer any demand. The mind becomes a battlefield between reality and programming, between what you know to be true and what your nervous system insists must be possible. You oscillate between moments of clarity where you can see the relationship objectively and moments of desperate longing so intense they feel like spiritual experiences. This is not emotional instability. This is the natural result of trying to run new software on hardware that was programmed for an entirely different operating system. And here we encounter one of the most dangerous myths about heartbreak: that time heals all wounds. Time does not heal the programming of love, it merely teaches you to live with it. The neural pathways carved by deep attachment do not disappear, they become dormant, waiting to be reactivated by the right stimulus. A song, a scent, a particular quality of light can trigger the full cascade of programmed responses years after you believed yourself to be healed. I worked with a man who had been divorced for 5 years, remarried, seemingly content with his new life. But he came to me because he had begun having panic attacks triggered by the most mundane circumstances, walking past a coffee shop where he used to meet his ex-wife, hearing a particular laugh in a crowded restaurant, even seeing handwriting that resembled hers. His body was still running the original love program in the background, and certain environmental cues could activate it with the force of a system crash. This is why heartbreak feels like madness, because it is a form of madness, a temporary psychosis induced by the collision between programmed expectations and altered reality. Your brain continues to predict the presence of someone who is no longer there, continues to seek connection with someone who has withdrawn their availability, continues to generate behaviors appropriate for a relationship that no longer exists. The suffering is not a bug in the system. It is a feature. Evolution programmed heartbreak to be unbearable because unbearable pain motivates desperate action. In the ancestral environment, the loss of a mate could mean the difference between survival and death, between successful reproduction and genetic extinction. The agony you feel when love ends is your DNA screaming at you to do whatever it takes to restore the bond, regardless of whether restoration is possible or even desirable. But we no longer live in the ancestral environment, and the programming that once served survival now often serves only to perpetuate suffering. The intensity of your heartbreak is not proportional to the actual threat to your well-being. It is proportional to how deeply love managed to embed itself in your psychological infrastructure before it was withdrawn. Understanding this mechanism does not make the pain less real, but it does reveal its true nature. You are not suffering because you are weak, or because you loved wrong, or because you failed to be enough. You are suffering because you are human, and humans are programmed to suffer when the bonds that define their identity are severed. The question then becomes not how to avoid this programming, for it is woven too deeply into the fabric of consciousness to be removed, but how to work with it, how to recognize its patterns, how to distinguish between the authentic signals of your deeper wisdom and the desperate broadcasts of a system in withdrawal. This recognition is the beginning of freedom, not from love itself, but from love's capacity to reduce you to a puppet, dancing to the rhythm of another person's presence or absence. But that freedom requires a descent into the very mechanisms that bind you, a willingness to examine the programming itself rather than simply enduring its effects. What I am about to show you will disturb you because it will reveal the extent to which your sense of self has been colonized by forces you never consciously chose to invite in. But disturbance is the price of awakening, and awakening is the only path to genuine liberation from the cycles of programmed suffering that masquerade as love. The programming of love operates through layers of deception so sophisticated that even as I describe them to you, part of your mind will resist accepting their reality. This resistance itself is part of the program, love's final defense mechanism against conscious examination. For if you truly understood how thoroughly you have been reprogrammed, you might never allow yourself to love again, and evolution cannot permit such awareness to spread. Consider this. When you fall in love, you believe you are choosing to open your heart to another person. But what is actually happening is far more sinister. Your nervous system is being hijacked by biological imperatives that care nothing for your happiness, your growth, or your individual well-being. You are being conscripted into an ancient biological agenda that views your personal suffering as an acceptable casualty in the war for genetic survival. The process begins with what researchers have termed the neurochemical cascade of attachment. In the early stages of love, your brain becomes a drug manufacturing facility, producing cocktails of dopamine, oxytocin, and phenylethylamine that create states of euphoria more intense than any substance you could ingest. But this flood of pleasure chemicals serves a specific purpose. It masks the installation of dependency protocols that will later become the source of your greatest agony. You see, pleasure and pain are not opposites in the brain, they are dance partners. Every surge of love-induced ecstasy carves deeper pathways for future suffering. The higher love lifts you, the further you have to fall when its support is withdrawn. This is not an accident of neurochemistry, it is its intended design. Nature needs you to become so addicted to another person's presence that their absence becomes unthinkable. I once treated a musician whose case illustrated this principle with devastating clarity. During the peak of his relationship, he composed what he considered his finest work, pieces that flowed from him with an ease that felt divinely inspired. He attributed this creative surge to love's influence, believing his partner had unlocked some hidden chamber of his artistic soul. But when she left him, something far more disturbing occurred than simple creative block. He found that he could no longer access the musical sensibilities that had defined his identity for decades. It was as if love had not enhanced his existing abilities, but had replaced them entirely with something that could only function in the presence of his beloved. Without her, he was not simply uninspired, he was musically lobotomized. Love had not awakened his gifts, it had colonized them, making them dependent on external validation for their very existence. This is the hidden cost of what we romantically call bringing out the best in each other. Love does not reveal your authentic self. It creates a version of you that can only exist in relationship to the beloved. This relational self may feel more vibrant, more capable, more alive than your individual self, but it is ultimately a mirage, a psychological prosthetic that appears real only as long as the other person remains present to validate its existence. When love ends, you do not simply lose your partner, you lose access to the version of yourself that felt most real, most worthy, most complete. The grief you experience is not just for the relationship, but for the death of an identity that felt more authentic than your original self. You are mourning someone who never actually existed independently, a phantom self that was conjured into being by the alchemy of mutual projection. But the programming runs deeper still. Love embeds itself not just in your present experience, but in your relationship to time itself. The beloved becomes the organizing principle around which your entire temporal landscape arranges itself. Past memories are categorized as before them or with them. Future plans become impossible to conceive without their participation. Present moments feel meaningful only to the extent that they can be shared with or reported to the beloved. When this temporal scaffolding collapses, you experience what I have come to call chronological vertigo, a disorientation so profound that you lose your ability to locate yourself in time. Past, present, and future collapse into a single moment of absence, a eternal now defined entirely by what is missing. You may find yourself unable to remember what you used to care about before this person, unable to imagine a future that does not include them, trapped in a present that feels simultaneously infinite and empty. This temporal distortion explains why heartbroken individuals often engage in behaviors that seem to defy rationality. They call their ex-partners at 3 a.m, they drive past their homes hoping for a glimpse, they refresh social media profiles with the compulsiveness of laboratory rats pressing levers for cocaine. They are not being pathetic, they are attempting to restore coherence to a temporal framework that has been shattered by the withdrawal of its organizing principle. The cruelest aspect of this programming is how it disguises itself as spiritual experience. The intensity of love, the sense of recognition when meeting the beloved, the feeling that this connection transcends ordinary human experience, all of this is carefully orchestrated biochemical theatre designed to make you mistake programming for divinity. You believe you have found your soulmate, your other half, your cosmic destiny, but what you have actually found is someone whose psychological wounds complement your own in ways that create maximum neurochemical activation. The sense of completion you feel is not the union of two whole beings, but the temporary alleviation of two different forms of emptiness. You are not healing each other. You are providing mutual distraction from the deeper work of individual wholeness. This is why love relationships often feel simultaneously sacred and addictive, why they can elevate you to experiences of transcendence while also reducing you to behaviors you would normally find degrading. You are experiencing the confusion of a system that has learned to mistake dependency for devotion, to confuse need with love, to interpret the relief of withdrawal symptoms as evidence of divine connection. The beloved becomes your drug, your religion, your reason for existence. But like all external sources of meaning, they are ultimately unreliable. They have their own programming to follow, their own psychological imperatives that may conflict with your needs. When they withdraw their presence, whether through breakup, death, or simple emotional unavailability, you do not just lose a person, you lose your access to meaning itself. This is why heartbreak can trigger existential crisis that extends far beyond the bounds of the relationship. When your source of meaning disappears, everything else loses its significance. Food becomes tasteless, activities become pointless, the future becomes unimaginable. You are not being dramatic. You are experiencing the natural consequence of having outsourced your sense of purpose to another human being. The mind, desperate to restore meaning, begins generating increasingly elaborate explanations for the beloved's departure. Perhaps they are testing your devotion. Perhaps they are scared of the intensity of their feelings. Perhaps they need time to recognize your true value. These are not hopes. They are withdrawal hallucinations, desperate fantasies generated by a system that cannot accept the termination of its primary meaning source. But beneath these conscious fantasies runs a deeper programming that is far more disturbing. Your unconscious begins to scan for evidence of your own inadequacy, searching for explanations that will allow you to believe that changing yourself might restore the connection. If you can identify what was wrong with you, you can fix it and win them back. This is the birth of the improvement obsession that consumes so many heartbroken individuals. You begin exercising compulsively, changing your appearance, developing new skills, pursuing achievements you hope will impress the absent beloved. But this self-improvement is not authentic growth. It is programming-driven behavior modification designed to make you acceptable to someone who has already declared you unacceptable. You are not becoming a better person. You are becoming a more sophisticated version of what you think they wanted. This pattern can continue for years, creating a life organized around the preferences of someone who is no longer present to benefit from your efforts. You become a ghost haunting your own existence, living for the approval of someone who has moved on, trapped in a feedback loop of self-modification that serves no one and satisfies nothing. The most insidious aspect of this programming is how it masquerades as virtue. The loyalty you feel to the absent beloved, the hope you maintain for reconciliation, the way you honor their memory by refusing to move on, all of this feels noble, romantic, even spiritual. But it is actually a form of psychological bondage, a refusal to accept reality that keeps you imprisoned in a relationship that exists only in your mind. You tell yourself that your suffering proves the depth of your love, that your inability to let go demonstrates your commitment, that your persistent hope shows your faith in true connection. But these are not virtues. They are symptoms of a system that has learned to mistake suffering for love, to confuse obsession with devotion, to interpret the inability to move forward as evidence of spiritual depth. The programming wants you to believe that real love never dies, that true connection transcends physical presence, that the depth of your pain proves the authenticity of your bond. But these beliefs serve only to perpetuate your imprisonment. They keep you feeding a system that no longer serves your growth, honoring a connection that exists only in your neurochemical memory banks. What you call eternal love is often just eternal programming, patterns carved so deeply into your psychological architecture that they continue running long after their original purpose has been fulfilled. You are not being faithful to love. You are being faithful to conditioning that was designed to serve genetic imperatives you never consciously chose to honor. Understanding this does not diminish the reality of what you felt, the joy, the connection, the moments of genuine intimacy were real. But they were real within a framework of programming that was always designed to be temporary, always intended to serve purposes larger than your individual happiness. The love was real, but the story you tell yourself about what that love means may be nothing more than evolutionary propaganda dressed up as spiritual truth. This recognition is the beginning of freedom, but it is a freedom that comes at a cost. To see the programming clearly, you must be willing to question everything you believe about love, connection, and the meaning of human relationships. You must be prepared to discover that much of what you have called your deepest self may actually be a collection of responses programmed by forces that care nothing for your well-being. But this questioning is not nihilism, it is archaeology. By excavating the layers of programming that have shaped your understanding of love, you create the possibility of choosing your responses rather than simply enacting them. You begin to distinguish between authentic love and programmed attachment, between genuine connection and neurochemical dependency. This distinction is not academic. It is the difference between freedom and bondage, between conscious choice and unconscious compulsion. But to make this distinction, you must first descend into the deepest layer of love's programming, the one that operates so far below conscious awareness that most people never suspect its existence. This is what I call the abandonment insurance policy that love writes into your psychological contract. From the moment attachment forms, your unconscious begins preparing for its inevitable dissolution. It starts building elaborate defense mechanisms designed to protect you from the very loss it simultaneously creates the conditions for. These defenses become so intricate, so all-consuming, that they often cause the abandonment they were meant to prevent. Consider the hypervigilance that develops in the depths of love. You begin scanning your beloved's behavior for micro-expressions of withdrawal, analyzing their tone for hints of diminishing interest, interpreting their need for space as evidence of impending departure. This is not paranoia. This is your attachment system running predictive algorithms designed to give you advance warning of relational threats. But these algorithms become self-fulfilling prophecies. Your constant monitoring creates the very distance you fear. Your need for reassurance becomes so consuming that it transforms love into a performance, connection into a test that must be passed daily. The beloved finds themselves walking on eggshells, careful not to trigger your abandonment detectors until the relationship becomes a prison for both participants. I once worked with a woman whose love programming had become so sophisticated that she could predict her partner's emotional state from the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. She had trained herself to read microscopic changes in his breathing patterns, the exact angle of his shoulders when he entered a room, the subtle variations in how he said good morning. She believed this hyper-attunement was evidence of her deep connection to him. But what she had actually developed was a surveillance system so comprehensive that it left no room for spontaneity, no space for her partner to have private emotional experiences, no possibility for the natural ebb and flow that healthy relationships require. Her love had become a form of emotional totalitarianism, and her partner eventually left not because he stopped caring, but because he could no longer breathe under the weight of her constant monitoring. This is how love's programming corrupts its own purpose. The very mechanisms designed to preserve attachment become the instruments of its destruction. The fear of abandonment creates behaviors that make abandonment inevitable. The desperate need for security generates insecurity. The attempt to control love destroys the spontaneity that makes love worth having. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this programming is how it colonizes your relationship to yourself. When love ends, you do not simply lose access to the beloved, you lose access to the parts of yourself that only emerged in their presence. The programming creates what I call relational compartments, aspects of your personality that become so dependent on external validation that they cannot exist independently. Your sense of humor may become tied to their laughter. Your confidence may depend on their admiration. Your creativity may require their appreciation to feel real. These are not enhancements of your existing qualities. They are qualities that exist only within the relational matrix, like programs that can only run on specific operating systems. When the relationship ends, these compartmentalized aspects of yourself go into a kind of psychological hibernation. You may find yourself unable to access forms of joy, creativity, or confidence that once felt natural. This is not because you have been damaged, it is because these qualities were never fully integrated into your individual identity. They were relational artifacts, projections that felt like authentic self-expression, but were actually co-created experiences that required two participants to maintain their reality. The grief you experience is not just for the loss of the other person, but for the loss of these relational selves that felt more real, more vibrant, more worthy than your individual identity. You are mourning the death of versions of yourself that could only exist in the presence of someone who is no longer available to call them into being. This explains why heartbroken individuals often describe feeling like they have lost themselves, like they no longer know who they are without their former partner. They are experiencing the deactivation of identity programs that were never fully their own to begin with. The self they are left with feels diminished, not because it has been damaged, but because it lacks the relational amplification that made it feel complete. The programming anticipates this loss and prepares accordingly. It begins creating what I call phantom relationship protocols, internal simulations of the beloved's presence that can provide temporary relief from the withdrawal symptoms of their absence. You find yourself having conversations with them in your mind, imagining their responses to daily events, making decisions based on what you think they would want. These internal simulations can become so vivid that you begin living in two realities simultaneously: the actual world, where they are absent, and the simulated world, where they remain present. You may catch yourself buying their favorite food, avoiding activities you know they would disapprove of, or feeling guilty for experiences you cannot share with them. This is not sentimentality. This is your attachment system attempting to maintain connection through psychological puppetry. You become both the puppeteer and the puppet, creating elaborate internal performances designed to simulate the presence of someone who is no longer there. The beloved becomes a psychological prosthetic, an artificial extension of your consciousness that provides the illusion of continued connection. But these simulations exact a terrible cost. They prevent you from fully inhabiting your present reality, keeping you tethered to a past that no longer exists and a future that will never arrive. You become a refugee from your own life, living in the exile of memory and fantasy, while your actual existence passes by unnoticed and unlived. The programming also creates what I call loyalty loops, recursive patterns of thought and behavior designed to honor the connection even after its termination. You may find yourself unable to throw away their belongings, unwilling to change routines you shared, resistant to experiences that might create new memories untainted by their absence. These loyalty loops masquerade as virtue, as evidence of your capacity for deep commitment, but they are actually forms of psychological bondage that keep you imprisoned in a relationship that exists only in your neurology. You are being faithful not to love, but to programming, honoring not the beloved, but the biological imperatives that shaped your attachment to them. The most insidious aspect of these loops is how they create the illusion of choice while actually eliminating it. You tell yourself you are choosing to remain loyal, choosing to preserve their memory, choosing to honor what you shared. But these are not choices, they are compulsions generated by programming that has learned to disguise itself as free will. True choice would involve the ability to remember without being imprisoned by memory, to honor the past without being unable to inhabit the present, to remain grateful for what was shared without being incapable of creating something new. But the programming makes such choice nearly impossible because it has wired loyalty into your identity so deeply that questioning it feels like self-betrayal. This is why moving on from deep love often requires what feels like an act of violence against yourself. You must sever connections that feel sacred, abandon loyalties that seem noble, release attachments that appear to define your capacity for devotion. The programming interprets this necessary liberation as betrayal, generating guilt so intense it can paralyze your efforts to reclaim your life. You begin to believe that letting go means you never really loved them, that healing proves your connection was shallow, that moving forward dishonors what you shared. But these beliefs are not coming from your authentic wisdom. They are coming from programming that benefits from your continued imprisonment, that gains power from your inability to distinguish between love and attachment, between honoring the past and being enslaved by it. The programming also creates what I call replacement protocols, unconscious search algorithms that scan your environment for individuals who might recreate the neurochemical patterns of the lost relationship. You find yourself attracted to people who share physical characteristics with your former beloved, who display similar mannerisms, who trigger the same patterns of activation in your nervous system. But these attractions are not based on genuine compatibility or authentic connection. They are attempts by your attachment system to restore the neurochemical status quo that was disrupted by the original loss. You are not choosing new partners. You are being chosen by programming that cares only about replicating familiar patterns of activation. This explains why people often find themselves in relationships that feel simultaneously familiar and unsatisfying, connections that provide temporary relief from the withdrawal symptoms of previous attachments while failing to offer genuine intimacy or growth. They are dating ghosts, pursuing phantoms, trying to use new people to solve old programming problems. The replacement protocols can operate for years or even decades, creating a series of relationships that feel significant in the moment, but ultimately serve only to maintain the original programming. Each new connection becomes a variation on the same theme, a different instrument playing the same neurochemical symphony that was first composed by the beloved who established the pattern. You may find yourself breaking up with people not because they are wrong for you, but because they are not enough, like the original template. Or conversely, you may find yourself staying in relationships that clearly do not serve your growth because they provide just enough neurochemical familiarity to keep the withdrawal symptoms at bay. These patterns continue until you become conscious of the programming itself, until you learn to distinguish between authentic attraction and neurochemical nostalgia, between genuine connection and the comfort of familiar dysfunction. But achieving this consciousness requires a willingness to examine the very foundations of what you have called love, to question whether your deepest attractions might be nothing more than sophisticated biological programs running on autopilot. The programming also creates temporal distortion fields around the memory of the beloved. Time spent with them becomes mythologized, elevated to a significance that may bear little resemblance to the actual quality of those experiences. Ordinary moments become sacred, mundane conversations become profound, simple pleasures become transcendent experiences that nothing in your current life can match. This temporal mythologization serves a specific function. It creates an impossible standard against which all future experiences must be measured. No present moment can compete with the idealized past. No current relationship can match the perfected memory of what was lost. You become a refugee from the present, always seeking to return to a golden age that may never have existed in the form your memory has constructed. The programming edits your memories with the sophistication of a master filmmaker, cutting out the boring parts, the conflicts, the moments of disconnection or disappointment. What remains is a highlight reel so compelling that it makes your current reality seem pale and insufficient by comparison. You are not remembering the relationship accurately. You are remembering the neurochemical peak experiences while forgetting the valleys, the ordinary moments, the times when you felt unseen or unheard. This edited version of the past becomes the template for what you believe love should feel like, creating expectations so unrealistic that they guarantee disappointment with any future connection. You are not seeking love. You are seeking to recreate a neurochemical experience that was itself largely artificial, a product of novelty and projection that could never have sustained itself over time. But perhaps the most profound way that love programs the mind to suffer is through what I call meaning monopolization. The beloved becomes not just a source of joy or companionship, but the primary organizing principle around which your entire sense of life's significance arranges itself. Their presence makes everything meaningful. Their absence makes everything pointless. This is not love. This is spiritual dependency disguised as devotion. You have outsourced your relationship to meaning itself, made another person responsible for your connection to purpose and significance. When they leave, they take not just themselves, but your access to meaning, leaving you in an existential wasteland where nothing seems to matter, because the person who made everything matter is no longer there to witness your experience. The programming creates this dependency deliberately because dependency ensures loyalty. If you can find meaning independently, you might choose to leave. If your sense of purpose relies on their presence, you become psychologically indentured to them. What feels like the deepest love is often the most sophisticated form of bondage, a golden chain that feels precious even as it restricts your freedom to grow beyond the boundaries of the relationship. When this meaning monopolization collapses, you experience what existential philosophers have called the dark night of the soul, a period of profound meaninglessness that can last months or years. But this darkness is not a spiritual crisis. It is withdrawal from meaning dependency, the painful process of reclaiming your own relationship to purpose and significance. The programming interprets this reclamation as betrayal, generating guilt for finding joy without them, shame for discovering that life can be meaningful in their absence, fear that healing means you never really loved them. But these are not authentic emotions. They are program-generated responses designed to keep you tethered to a meaning system that no longer serves your growth. Breaking free from this meaning, monopolization requires what I call existential archaeology, the painstaking work of excavating your own sources of purpose from beneath the layers of program dependency. You must learn to distinguish between authentic meaning and borrowed significance, between genuine purpose and the intoxicating feeling of being necessary to someone else's happiness. This excavation is not pleasant work. It requires you to confront the possibility that much of what you called your deepest self may have been nothing more than a collection of responses designed to maintain another person's interest. It demands that you examine whether your passions, your values, your very sense of identity might have been unconsciously shaped by the need to remain attractive to someone who is no longer present to be attracted. I worked with a professor whose case illuminated this process with painful clarity. For 15 years, she had shared her life with a fellow academic whose intellectual interests had gradually become her own. She had convinced herself that their convergent passions were evidence of their perfect compatibility, proof that they were intellectual soulmates destined to explore the mysteries of existence together. When he left her for a younger colleague, she discovered something that shattered her understanding of herself. She could no longer access genuine enthusiasm for the subjects that had defined her career. The books that once fascinated her felt foreign. The ideas that had energized her seemed hollow. She realized that her intellectual passion had become entirely dependent on his validation, his engagement, his presence as an audience for her thoughts. She had not been pursuing knowledge, she had been pursuing his approval disguised as knowledge. Her entire academic identity had been a performance designed to maintain his interest, and without him there to witness it, the performance felt pointless. She was forced to confront the terrifying possibility that she had no idea what actually interested her, independent of his influence. This is the existential crisis that awaits anyone who has allowed love to colonize their relationship to meaning. You discover that you have been living someone else's life while believing it was your own, pursuing someone else's dreams while thinking they were yours, becoming someone else's ideal while losing touch with your authentic self. The programming also creates what I call phantom future syndrome, the inability to construct meaningful visions of tomorrow that do not include the absent beloved. Your imagination becomes so colonized by shared dreams that you cannot conceive of a future worth wanting that does not feature their participation. Every goal feels hollow, every ambition seems pointless, every possibility appears diminished by their absence. This temporal paralysis serves the programming's purposes perfectly. If you cannot imagine a desirable future without them, you will remain psychologically available for their return. Your inability to move forward becomes a form of unconscious loyalty, a way of keeping yourself in position should they decide to resurrect the connection. But this loyalty comes at the cost of your own evolution. You become frozen in the developmental stage you occupied when the relationship ended, unable to grow beyond the version of yourself that was shaped by their influence. Years pass, opportunities arise and disappear, but you remain psychologically suspended in the moment of their departure, waiting for permission to resume living that will never come. The most sophisticated aspect of love's programming is how it creates what I call recursive validation loops. The beloved's opinion of you becomes so integral to your self-worth that you continue seeking their approval long after they have withdrawn their availability to provide it. You find yourself making decisions based on what you imagine they would think, avoiding choices you believe they would disapprove of, living according to standards they established, even though they are no longer present to enforce them. This internalized validation system can operate for decades, creating a life lived in service to the preferences of someone who has moved on. You become your own prison guard, enforcing restrictions they never asked you to maintain, honoring boundaries they never requested you observe. The beloved becomes a psychological dictator ruling from exile, controlling your choices through the ghost of their influence. I encountered a man whose case revealed the extremes this programming can reach. His wife had died in an accident 7 years earlier, but he continued living exactly as if she might return at any moment. Her clothes remained in the closet, her side of the bed stayed empty, Her favorite meals appeared on the table every evening. He had not dated, had not traveled, had not made any significant changes to their shared life. He told himself this was love, that his consistency proved the depth of his devotion. But what he had actually created was a shrine to programming, a museum of attachment that prevented him from continuing to exist as a living being. He was not honoring her memory. He was being controlled by the neural patterns she had established, patterns that continued running their program long after their original purpose had become impossible to fulfill. The programming had convinced him that moving forward would be betrayal, that healing would prove his love was shallow, that creating new experiences would dishonor what they had shared. But these beliefs were not coming from love. They were coming from attachment algorithms designed to prevent abandonment, even when abandonment was no longer possible. This is perhaps the most cruel aspect of love's programming. It can continue operating even after death, even after the beloved has explicitly chosen someone else, even after all rational hope of reunion has been exhausted. The algorithms care nothing for reality. They care only for maintaining the patterns they were designed to preserve. Breaking free from these recursive loops requires what I call validation sovereignty, the reclamation of your right to approve of yourself independent of anyone else's opinion. This is not narcissism or selfishness. It is the basic psychological hygiene necessary for mental health. You must learn to distinguish between genuine self-improvement and self-modification designed to win back someone who has already declared you inadequate. The programming also creates what I call emotional Stockholm syndrome. You begin to identify with the very system that imprisons you, defending the programming against your own liberation efforts. When friends suggest you should move on, you feel compelled to explain why your situation is different, why your love was special, why ordinary advice does not apply to your unique circumstances. This defense of the programming masquerades as loyalty to the beloved, but it is actually loyalty to the system that keeps you imprisoned. You have become so identified with your suffering that releasing it feels like losing your identity. The pain becomes proof of your capacity for deep feeling. The obsession becomes evidence of your spiritual depth. The inability to let go becomes a badge of romantic honor. But this identification with suffering is not love. It is trauma bonding with your own programming. You have confused the intensity of your attachment with the authenticity of your connection, mistaken the compulsiveness of your longing for the purity of your devotion. The programming wants you to believe that real love never dies, that true devotion requires eternal suffering, that moving on means you never really cared. These beliefs serve only to perpetuate your imprisonment. They keep you feeding a system that no longer nourishes you, honoring a connection that exists only in your neurology, remaining faithful to programming that was designed to serve purposes you never consciously chose to support. The programming also creates what I call comparative devaluation protocols. Every new person you meet is automatically measured against the idealized template of the lost beloved, and they inevitably fall short because they are being compared not to a real person, but to a neurochemically enhanced memory. The programming has created an impossible standard that ensures no future connection can provide the same level of activation. This comparison trap can operate for years, causing you to reject potentially compatible partners because they do not trigger the same intensity of response as your original attachment. You mistake familiarity for compatibility, intensity for intimacy, neurochemical activation for authentic connection. The programming has taught you to confuse the symptoms of addiction with the signs of true love. I worked with a woman who had been single for 8 years after the end of what she called her great love. She went on dates, met interesting people, even developed friendships that could have evolved into something deeper, but she consistently found herself disappointed by what she described as the absence of spark, the lack of the electric connection she had felt with her former partner. What she had not recognized was that the spark she sought was not love. It was the activation of familiar trauma patterns. Her great love had been someone whose emotional unavailability perfectly matched her childhood programming around abandonment and rejection. The intensity she craved was not passion, but the familiar pain of trying to earn love from someone incapable of providing it consistently. Every healthy person she met felt boring by comparison because they did not trigger her trauma responses, did not activate the neurochemical cocktail she had learned to associate with true connection. She was seeking not love but the comfort of familiar dysfunction, not intimacy but the excitement of emotional danger. This is how the programming perpetuates itself across relationships and even across generations. It teaches you to mistake intensity for intimacy, to confuse drama with passion, to interpret the absence of familiar pain as evidence of incompatibility. You become addicted not to love but to the specific neurochemical signature of your original attachment, doomed to seek its recreation in circumstances that cannot provide it. The programming also creates what I call loyalty testing mechanisms. You find yourself unconsciously evaluating new potential partners based on their willingness to tolerate behaviors that would drive healthy people away. If they maintain interest despite your emotional unavailability, your tendency to compare them unfavorably to your ex, your obvious attachment to someone else, then perhaps they are worthy of your consideration. But this testing process selects for people who have their own programming issues, their own trauma responses that make them attracted to unavailable partners. You end up in relationships with people who are drawn to your dysfunction rather than your wholeness, connections built on mutual programming rather than authentic compatibility. These programmed relationships can provide temporary relief from the withdrawal symptoms of your original attachment, but they cannot provide genuine intimacy because both participants are relating primarily to each other's trauma responses rather than their authentic selves. You become trapped in a cycle of relationships that feel familiar but never fulfilling, connections that scratch the surface of your programming without touching the deeper needs of your soul. The programming anticipates this dissatisfaction and uses it as evidence for its own narrative. See, it whispers, no one else can make you feel the way they did. No other connection can match what you lost. You should stop trying to replace the irreplaceable and focus on getting them back. But this is not wisdom. This is the voice of programming defending itself against dissolution. The reason no other relationship feels the same is not because your lost love was uniquely perfect, but because you are unconsciously seeking to recreate specific neurochemical patterns rather than exploring what authentic connection might feel like when freed from the constraints of familiar dysfunction. Breaking free from this cycle requires what I call pattern interruption, the conscious choice to respond differently to familiar triggers, to seek connection based on compatibility rather than chemistry, to prioritize growth over comfort. This is not easy work because it requires you to give up the intoxicating intensity of program connection in favor of the quieter satisfactions of authentic relationship. The programming will resist this interruption with every tool at its disposal. It will generate nostalgia for what you are leaving behind, fear of what you might be missing, doubt about whether authentic connection can ever match the intensity of programmed attachment. But these responses are not coming from your deeper wisdom. They are coming from algorithms that have learned to mistake suffering for significance. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of love's programming is how it creates what I call meaning laundering, the process by which programmed responses are reinterpreted as spiritual experiences. Neurochemical addiction is reframed as transcendent connection, and psychological dysfunction is elevated to the status of sacred devotion. The intensity of your attachment becomes proof of your capacity for deep love. The obsessiveness of your thoughts becomes evidence of spiritual connection. The inability to let go becomes a sign of your loyalty and commitment. The programming convinces you that your suffering is holy, that your pain is purposeful, that your imprisonment is actually a form of higher love. This spiritual reframing serves to protect the programming from rational examination. If your attachment is sacred, then questioning it becomes sacrilege. If your pain is purposeful, then seeking relief becomes betrayal. If your obsession is evidence of spiritual depth, then healing becomes shallowness. But true spirituality does not require suffering for its validation. Authentic love does not demand the sacrifice of your well-being for its proof. Genuine devotion does not ask you to remain imprisoned in patterns that prevent your growth. The programming has learned to wear the mask of spirituality to avoid detection, but beneath the mask are the same biological imperatives that care nothing for your evolution. I once worked with a woman who had spent 12 years in what she called a twin flame relationship with a man who appeared in her life sporadically, offering just enough connection to maintain her attachment before disappearing again for months at a time. She had constructed an elaborate spiritual mythology around their connection, interpreting his unavailability as evidence of their soul's need to grow independently before reuniting. She believed their relationship transcended ordinary human love, that their periodic separations were orchestrated by higher forces to teach them lessons they needed to learn. She had turned her suffering into a spiritual practice, her longing into a form of devotion, her obsession into evidence of their cosmic destiny. But when we examined the actual patterns of their interaction, what emerged was not a transcendent love story, but a textbook case of intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful conditioning schedule known to psychology. His unpredictable availability had created an addiction so complete that she interpreted withdrawal symptoms as spiritual purification, craving as divine longing, and the hope for his return as faith in cosmic love. The programming had hijacked her spiritual vocabulary to justify its own perpetuation. Every moment of pain became a lesson. Every period of absence became a test. Every failed reunion became evidence that they needed more time to prepare for their ultimate destiny. She had created a belief system so complete that it could accommodate any evidence against itself, reinterpreting every contradiction as confirmation of its own truth. This is the ultimate sophistication of love's programming, its ability to colonize your meaning, making faculties so completely that you cannot distinguish between authentic spiritual experience and neurochemical addiction dressed in sacred clothing. The intensity of your feelings becomes proof of their significance. The compulsiveness of your thoughts becomes evidence of their importance. The inability to move forward becomes a sign of your spiritual evolution. Breaking free from this meaning. Laundering requires what I call spiritual discernment, the ability to distinguish between experiences that genuinely serve your growth and those that merely feel intense. True spiritual connection expands your capacity for joy, increases your ability to love others, enhances your sense of connection to life itself. Programming-driven attachment does the opposite. It narrows your world, diminishes your capacity for other relationships, and makes everything except the object of your attachment feel meaningless. The programming also creates what I call selective memory optimization. Your recollection of the relationship becomes increasingly distorted over time, with negative experiences fading while positive moments become more vivid and significant. Arguments are forgotten, disappointments are minimized, moments of disconnection disappear from conscious memory, while instances of harmony are elevated to mythic status. This memory editing serves a specific function. It maintains the idealization necessary to keep you attached to someone who is no longer available. If you remembered the relationship accurately, including its limitations and disappointments, you might be able to let go more easily. But the programming cannot allow accurate memory because accurate memory might lead to authentic acceptance. Instead, it creates a version of the past so compelling that the present cannot compete with it. No current experience can match the edited highlights of what you shared. No potential partner can measure up to the idealized version of someone who never actually existed in the form your memory has constructed. This selective optimization can continue for decades, creating a past that becomes more perfect with each passing year. The beloved becomes not a person you once knew, but a symbol of everything missing from your current life, a repository for all your unmet needs and unlived dreams. You are not missing them. You are missing the fantasy version your programming has created to keep you bound to patterns that no longer serve your growth. The most devastating aspect of this memory distortion is how it prevents you from learning from the actual experience of the relationship. If you cannot remember what went wrong, you cannot understand why it ended. If you cannot acknowledge its limitations, you cannot grow beyond the patterns that created those limitations. The programming keeps you ignorant of the very lessons that might free you from its influence. Breaking free from selective memory optimization requires what I call radical honesty about the past. You must be willing to remember not just the peak experiences, but the valleys, not just the moments of connection, but the times of disconnection, not just how they made you feel at your best, but how they made you feel at your worst. This honest remembering is not an attack on the relationship or the person you loved. It is not an attempt to diminish what was beautiful or meaningful about your connection. It is simply the restoration of accurate memory as the foundation for authentic choice. You cannot make conscious decisions about your future based on edited versions of your past. The programming resists this honest examination because it knows that accurate memory might lead to accurate assessment, and accurate assessment might reveal that what you are mourning is not as perfect as you have been led to believe. The beloved might be revealed as a complex human being with their own limitations rather than the idealized figure your programming has constructed. But this revelation is not a loss, it is liberation. When you can see the relationship clearly, you can appreciate what was genuinely valuable about it without being imprisoned by what was limiting. You can honor what you shared without being unable to create something new. You can remember with gratitude rather than with the desperate longing that keeps you tethered to the past. The programming also creates what I call future foreclosure, the inability to imagine meaningful possibilities that do not include the absent beloved. Your capacity for hope becomes so colonized by shared dreams that you cannot conceive of a tomorrow worth wanting that does not feature their participation. Every potential future feels diminished by their absence. Every possibility seems less significant without their witness. This foreclosure serves the programming's agenda perfectly. If you cannot imagine a desirable future without them, you will remain psychologically available for their return. Your inability to construct meaningful visions of tomorrow becomes a form of unconscious fidelity, a way of keeping yourself in position should they choose to resurrect the connection. But this fidelity comes at the cost of your own evolution. You become developmentally frozen, unable to grow beyond the version of yourself that existed in relationship to them. Time passes, opportunities arise and disappear, but you remain suspended in the moment of their departure, waiting for permission to continue living that will never arrive. I worked with a man whose future had been so thoroughly colonized by shared dreams with his ex-wife that he could not imagine wanting anything that did not include her participation. They had planned to travel together, to start a business together, to grow old together. When she left, these dreams did not simply disappoint him. They made every other possibility feel hollow by comparison. He found himself unable to make plans more than a few days in advance because any extended vision of the future triggered overwhelming grief for the life they would never share. His imagination had become so dependent on her presence that it could not function independently. He was not just missing her, he was missing his own capacity to dream. This future foreclosure had practical consequences that extended far beyond his emotional life. He could not commit to career opportunities because they did not align with the plans they had made together. He could not consider relocating because it would mean abandoning the geographical context of their shared dreams. He could not invest in new relationships because they would require him to construct futures that did not include her. The programming had convinced him that moving forward would be a betrayal of what they had meant to each other, that creating new dreams would dishonor the ones they had shared, that imagining happiness without her would prove his love had been shallow. But these beliefs were not coming from love. They were coming from algorithms designed to maintain attachment regardless of its cost to his well-being. Breaking free from future foreclosure requires what I call imaginative sovereignty, the reclamation of your right to dream independently of anyone else's participation. This is not selfishness, it is basic psychological health. You must learn to distinguish between dreams that genuinely excite you and dreams that feel meaningful only because they were shared with someone whose approval you still crave. The programming will resist this imaginative liberation with every tool at its disposal. It will generate guilt for wanting things they cannot share, shame for finding excitement in possibilities that do not include them, fear that moving forward means you never really loved them. But these responses are not coming from your authentic values. They are coming from systems designed to keep you psychologically indentured to someone who has already chosen to be free. Perhaps the most profound way that love programs the mind to suffer is through what I call existential dependency, the outsourcing of your relationship to life's meaning itself. The beloved becomes not just a source of joy or companionship, but the lens through which existence becomes significant. Their presence makes everything matter. Their absence makes everything pointless. This dependency operates below the level of conscious choice. You do not decide to make them responsible for your sense of purpose. It happens gradually, imperceptibly, as your emotional well-being becomes increasingly tied to their availability. Their mood affects your mood, their problems become your problems, their dreams become more important than your own. You begin to exist primarily as a reflection of their regard for you. When they are pleased with you, you feel worthwhile. When they are distant, you question your value. When they are happy, life feels meaningful. When they are struggling, nothing else seems to matter. You have become a satellite orbiting around their emotional gravity, deriving your sense of significance from your proximity to their light. This existential dependency feels like love because it generates such intense feelings of connection and purpose. But it is actually a form of spiritual vampirism. You are feeding off their energy to maintain your own sense of aliveness. When they withdraw that energy, you do not simply feel sad. You feel like you are ceasing to exist. The programming creates this dependency because dependency ensures loyalty. If you can find meaning independently, you might choose to leave. If your sense of purpose relies on their presence, you become psychologically bonded to them in ways that transcend choice. What feels like the deepest love is often the most sophisticated form of spiritual bondage. When existential dependency collapses, when the person who made life meaningful is no longer available to provide that meaning, you experience what mystics have called the dark night of the soul. But this darkness is not a spiritual crisis. It is withdrawal from meaning dependency, the painful process of reclaiming your own relationship to purpose and significance. The programming interprets this reclamation as betrayal. It generates guilt for finding joy without them, shame for discovering that life can be meaningful in their absence, fear that healing means you never really loved them. But these are not authentic emotions. They are program-generated responses designed to keep you tethered to a meaning system that no longer serves your growth. Breaking free from existential dependency requires what I call meaning sovereignty, the recognition that your relationship to life's significance must be your own creation, not something borrowed from or dependent upon another person's presence. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of recovering from programmed love, because it requires you to face the possibility that much of what you have called your deepest self may have been nothing more than a reflection of someone else's regard. But this confrontation, while painful, is also liberating. When you reclaim responsibility for your own meaning-making, you discover capacities for joy, purpose, and significance that do not depend on anyone else's availability. You become internally resourced rather than externally dependent, whole rather than fragmentary, sovereign rather than enslaved. This sovereignty does not make you incapable of love. It makes you capable of authentic love rather than programmed attachment. When you no longer need another person to make life meaningful, you can choose to share meaning with them rather than demanding that they provide it. When you are no longer dependent on their presence for your sense of worth, you can appreciate their qualities without being addicted to their validation. The programming will resist this sovereignty with everything it has because sovereignty threatens its very existence. It will generate fear that independence means isolation, doubt that you can be happy alone, anxiety that no one will want you if you do not need them. But these fears are not prophetic. They are the death rattles of systems that have learned to mistake dependency for devotion. True love does not require the sacrifice of your sovereignty for its validation. Authentic connection does not demand that you become half a person seeking completion in another. Genuine intimacy does not ask you to abandon your relationship to meaning in favor of borrowed significance. The programming has taught you to confuse these sacrifices with virtue, to interpret your willingness to disappear into another person as evidence of your capacity for deep love. But disappearing is not loving, it is avoiding the responsibility of becoming fully yourself. And until you become fully yourself, you have nothing authentic to offer anyone else. This recognition is the beginning of true freedom, not from love itself, but from love's capacity to reduce you to a fragment seeking completion, a satellite seeking something to orbit, a program seeking validation for its own existence. But achieving this freedom requires one final descent into the deepest layer of love's programming, the foundational algorithm that makes all the others possible. This foundational algorithm is what I call the incompleteness protocol, the deepest program of all, installed not by love, but by the very structure of human consciousness itself. From the moment awareness emerges, you are taught that you are insufficient, that wholeness lies somewhere outside yourself, that completion can only be achieved through union with another. This is not the teaching of any particular culture or family. It is the whisper of biology itself, the evolutionary imperative that has shaped every aspect of how you understand connection. The incompleteness protocol operates through a simple but devastating premise. You are half a person seeking your other half. This mythology feels so natural, so obviously true, that questioning it seems absurd. Of course you need another person to complete you. Of course love is about finding someone who fills what you lack. Of course the deepest relationships are those where you become one with another soul. But this premise is not truth, it is programming. And it is the most dangerous programming of all because it makes every other program possible. If you believe you are incomplete, then you will seek completion. If you seek completion in another person, you will become dependent on their presence for your sense of wholeness. If you become dependent, you will become programmable. The incompleteness protocol begins its work in early childhood, long before romantic love enters the picture. You learn that your needs can only be met by others, that your emotions require external validation to be real, that your worth depends on how others respond to you. These lessons feel like basic facts about human nature, but they are actually the installation of dependency software that will later make you vulnerable to love's more sophisticated programs. I once worked with a successful surgeon whose case revealed the depths to which this protocol can penetrate. She had spent her entire adult life achieving external markers of success, advanced degrees, professional recognition, financial security. Yet she described feeling fundamentally empty when not in relationship. Every period of being single felt like a medical emergency, a condition that required immediate treatment through the acquisition of a romantic partner. She could save lives, manage complex medical procedures, lead teams of specialists, but she could not sit alone in her apartment for a weekend without feeling like something essential was missing. The incompleteness protocol had convinced her that her professional competence, her intellectual abilities, her capacity for independent achievement were all ultimately meaningless without romantic validation. When relationships ended, she did not just lose a partner. She lost access to the feeling of being a complete person. Her sense of wholeness had become so dependent on external reflection that she could not maintain it independently. She was a brilliant, accomplished woman who had been programmed to believe she was fundamentally insufficient on her own. This is the cruel genius of the incompleteness protocol. It can coexist with any level of external success without being challenged. You can master complex skills, achieve recognition in your field, develop deep friendships, contribute meaningfully to your community, and still feel that something essential is missing until you find romantic love. The protocol operates in a domain that no amount of individual achievement can touch. The programming reinforces itself through every love story you encounter, every song about finding your other half, every movie about incomplete people who become whole through romantic union. The culture surrounding you constantly confirms that yes, you are insufficient alone. Yes, completion requires another person. Yes, the highest form of human experience is the merger of two incomplete beings into one complete unit. But merger is not love. It is the dissolution of the very individuality that makes love possible. When two incomplete people attempt to complete each other, they do not create wholeness. They create a system of mutual dependency that masquerades as intimacy. Neither person can afford to grow beyond the role they play in maintaining the other's sense of completion, because growth might threaten the delicate balance that keeps both from feeling their underlying insufficiency. I encountered a couple whose relationship illustrated this dynamic with disturbing clarity. They had been together for 9 years and both described their connection as their greatest source of meaning and joy. But when I examined the actual patterns of their interaction, what emerged was not love but a sophisticated system of mutual completion that had made individual growth impossible for either of them. She had taken responsibility for his emotional regulation, becoming so attuned to his moods that she could predict and prevent his emotional storms before they began. He had become responsible for her sense of security, making all major decisions and handling anything that might cause her anxiety. They had divided the functions of a complete person between them, each becoming half of what they might have been individually. This arrangement felt like perfect love because it eliminated the terror of incompleteness for both of them. But it also eliminated the possibility of authentic intimacy because neither was relating to the other as a complete person. They were relating to the specific functions the other performed in maintaining their psychological equilibrium. When he suggested they might benefit from some time apart to pursue individual interests, she experienced it as a threat to her very existence. When she began developing friendships that did not include him, he felt like she was preparing to abandon him. Neither could tolerate the other's independence because their sense of wholeness depended on maintaining the merger that made them feel complete. The incompleteness protocol had created what appeared to be a loving relationship, but was actually a sophisticated prison that kept both people from discovering what they might become if they were not constantly managing each other's sense of insufficiency. They were not in love. They were in mutual completion, which is a very different thing. True love can only exist between two people who have already achieved a basic sense of completeness independently. When you know yourself to be fundamentally whole, you can choose to share that wholeness with another person without needing them to provide what you believe you lack. But as long as the incompleteness protocol is running, you cannot love. You can only seek completion through the consumption of another person's energy. The protocol also creates what I call completion addiction, the compulsive need to find someone who will make you feel whole, followed by the inevitable disappointment when they fail to provide the permanent sense of completeness you seek. No person can make you complete because completeness is not something that can be given from outside. It is something that must be discovered within. But the protocol interprets this failure as evidence that you have simply not found the right person yet. It generates hope that the next relationship will provide what the last one could not, that somewhere out there is your perfect match who will finally make you feel whole. This hope becomes the addiction as powerful as any substance, keeping you seeking external completion even as each failed attempt proves its impossibility. I worked with a woman who had been in 7 serious relationships over 15 years, each one beginning with the intoxicating feeling that she had finally found her missing piece. The early stages of each relationship felt like coming home, like discovering a part of herself she had never known existed. But inevitably, the feeling would fade, leaving her once again aware of the emptiness that no amount of love seemed able to fill. Rather than questioning the premise that completion should come from outside, she questioned her choice of partners. Each breakup became evidence that she needed to be more selective, more patient, more discerning in her search for the person who would finally complete her. The incompleteness protocol had convinced her that the problem was not with her approach, but with her execution. She had never considered the possibility that the emptiness she felt was not a sign of incompleteness, but an invitation to discover her own wholeness. The protocol had trained her to interpret inner space as absence rather than presence, to see solitude as loneliness rather than an opportunity for self-discovery, to experience independence as isolation rather than freedom. This misinterpretation of inner space is one of the protocol's most devastating effects. The capacity to be alone with yourself without feeling empty is not a luxury. It is a necessity for authentic love. If you cannot tolerate your own company, you will use relationships to avoid the discomfort of self-encounter, turning every partnership into a sophisticated escape mechanism. The protocol creates what I call solitude intolerance, the inability to be alone without feeling like something essential is missing. You may fill your schedule with social activities, surround yourself with acquaintances, maintain constant contact with friends and family, all to avoid the terrifying prospect of spending extended time with only yourself for company. But this avoidance of solitude is also avoidance of the very self-discovery that would reveal your inherent completeness. The emptiness you feel when alone is not evidence of your insufficiency. It is the space where your authentic self is waiting to be discovered. The protocol has taught you to fill this space with external stimulation rather than exploring what it might contain. When you can sit in solitude without needing to escape, when you can enjoy your own company without feeling lonely, when you can find meaning and joy in activities that require no external validation, then you begin to discover that completeness was never something you lacked. It was something you were programmed not to recognize. This recognition does not happen overnight. The incompleteness protocol has roots that extend back to your earliest experiences of dependency, and dismantling it requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to tolerate the discomfort of questioning your most basic assumptions about human nature. The protocol also creates what I call projection addiction, the compulsive need to see qualities in others that you believe you lack yourself. You become attracted to people who display confidence because you feel insecure, creativity because you feel mundane, emotional stability because you feel chaotic. But you are not actually attracted to these people. You are attracted to the qualities you have disowned in yourself. This projection creates relationships based on mutual completion rather than mutual appreciation. You need them to be confident so you can feel secure. They need you to be supportive so they can feel valued. Neither of you is relating to the other as a complete person. You are relating to the specific projections that make you feel whole, but projections are not sustainable. Eventually, you discover that the confident person also has insecurities, that the creative person also has mundane moments, that the stable person also experiences chaos. When your projections collapse, the relationship often collapses with them because it was built on the need for the other to be what you believed you were not. I encountered a man whose relationship history was a perfect illustration of this pattern. He was consistently attracted to women who seemed to possess an inner peace he felt he lacked. He would pursue them with intense focus, convinced that proximity to their serenity would calm the anxiety that plagued his daily existence. But in every case, as the relationship deepened and he saw more of their complete humanity, he would discover that they were not the peaceful beings he had imagined. They had their own anxieties, their own inner turmoil, their own struggles with finding serenity. The discovery that they were human rather than archetypal always led to profound disappointment and eventual relationship dissolution. He had never considered that the peace he sought in others might be something he could develop within himself. The incompleteness protocol had convinced him that serenity was a quality some people possessed and others lacked, rather than a capacity that could be cultivated through inner work. He was seeking to acquire through relationship what could only be developed through individual practice. The protocol also generates what I call completion urgency, the feeling that finding the right person is a matter of existential emergency, that every day spent single is a day wasted, that time is running out for achieving the wholeness that only romantic love can provide. This urgency drives desperate searching behaviors that often sabotage the very connections they are meant to create. When you approach potential partners from a place of completion urgency, you are not seeing them clearly. You are scanning them for their potential to fill your sense of emptiness, evaluating their usefulness as completion devices rather than appreciating them as complete beings in their own right. This utilitarian approach to relationship creates connections that feel forced, desperate, and ultimately unsatisfying for both people involved. The urgency also creates what I call settling patterns, the tendency to commit to relationships that provide some relief from incompleteness even when they lack genuine compatibility or mutual growth potential. You become so desperate to feel complete that you mistake any reduction in emptiness for evidence of true connection. I worked with a woman who had married a man not because she loved him deeply, but because being with him made her feel less alone. She described their relationship as comfortable, stable, predictable, all qualities that provided relief from the anxiety of incompleteness. But comfort is not love, and the absence of loneliness is not the same as the presence of joy. Years into the marriage, she began to feel a different kind of emptiness. Not the emptiness of being alone, but the emptiness of being with someone who did not see or appreciate her authentic self. She had traded the discomfort of incompleteness for the different discomfort of being unknown within relationship. The protocol had convinced her this was an acceptable trade, but her soul knew otherwise. The incompleteness protocol also creates what I call merger fantasy, the belief that true love involves the complete union of two people into one being, the dissolution of individual boundaries in favor of shared identity. This fantasy feels romantic because it promises the ultimate relief from the burden of being a separate self. But merger is not love. It is the death of love. Love requires two distinct beings who choose to share their completeness with each other. When boundaries dissolve completely, there is no longer anyone there to love or be loved by. You cannot have intimacy without individuality, connection without separation, union without the preservation of distinct identities. The merger fantasy creates relationships that feel intensely romantic in the beginning, but become suffocating over time. The initial dissolution of boundaries feels like coming home, like finding the missing piece of yourself. But as the merger deepens, both people begin to lose access to their individual identities, their personal interests, their capacity for independent thought and feeling. I encountered a couple whose relationship had devolved into what could only be described as mutual consumption. They spent every free moment together, shared all the same friends, had developed identical opinions on every topic, and could no longer remember what they had enjoyed individually before meeting each other. They described this merger as evidence of their perfect compatibility, proof that they were meant to be together. But when I observed their interactions, what I saw was not love, but the systematic erasure of two unique individuals in favor of a single diminished entity that possessed neither person's full potential. They had become so merged that neither could make decisions without consulting the other, express preferences that might create difference, or pursue interests that did not include their partner. The merger that had felt like ultimate intimacy had become a form of mutual imprisonment that prevented either person from continuing to grow. The incompleteness protocol convinces you that this merger is the goal of love, that the highest form of relationship is one where you can no longer distinguish between yourself and your partner. But this is not love. It is the avoidance of the work required to become a complete individual capable of authentic connection. True love does not eliminate differences. It celebrates them. It does not dissolve boundaries. It makes them permeable. It does not create merger. It creates communion between two whole beings who have something valuable to offer each other precisely because they have not lost themselves in the relationship. The protocol also generates what I call completion competition, the unconscious rivalry that develops when two incomplete people try to use each other for wholeness. Since neither person has enough internal resources to maintain their own sense of completeness while also providing it for their partner, a subtle competition emerges over who gets to feel whole at any given moment. This competition often manifests as emotional caretaking dynamics, where one person takes responsibility for the other's feelings while neglecting their own, or as attention-seeking behaviors where partners compete for who gets to be the focus of concern and care. The relationship becomes a zero-sum game where one person's wholeness comes at the expense of the others. I worked with a couple whose relationship had become a sophisticated system of alternating crisis and rescue. When one partner was struggling, the other would step into caretaker mode, providing the support and attention that made the struggling partner feel temporarily complete. But this dynamic required that someone always be in crisis and someone always be providing care. They had unconsciously organized their relationship around taking turns being the incomplete one who needed care and the complete one who provided it. Neither person was allowed to feel simultaneously whole because their system required constant imbalance to function. They were not loving each other. They were using each other as completion devices in a carefully choreographed dance of mutual dependency. The competition for completion also creates what I call emotional labor imbalances, where one person consistently provides more emotional support than they receive, not out of generosity, but out of the need to feel needed. Being the caretaker becomes a way of maintaining some sense of wholeness when you cannot generate it independently. But this caretaking is not love. It is completion-seeking disguised as service. The caretaker needs the other person to remain somewhat broken so they can continue feeling valuable, while the cared-for person becomes addicted to the attention that makes them feel temporarily whole. Both people become trapped in roles that prevent authentic growth and connection. The incompleteness protocol also creates what I call authenticity avoidance, the tendency to hide aspects of yourself that might threaten the completion dynamic. If your partner loves you for specific qualities that make them feel whole, you learn to emphasize those qualities while suppressing anything that might disrupt their sense of completeness. You become a performer in your own relationship, carefully managing your self-presentation to maintain the other person's projection of you as their missing piece. This performance requires enormous energy and creates profound loneliness because you are never truly seen or loved for who you actually are, only for the role you play in someone else's completion fantasy. I encountered a man whose wife had fallen in love with his strength and stability during a difficult period in her life, but maintaining this image required him to suppress his own vulnerability, his moments of uncertainty, his need for support and care. He became trapped in the role of the strong one, unable to express weakness without threatening the foundation of their relationship. Over time, this performance became so exhausting that he began to feel resentful of the very qualities that had originally attracted his wife. His strength felt like a prison rather than a gift, because it could never be balanced by corresponding vulnerability. He was loved for being half a person, the half that served her completion needs, while the other half remained hidden and unloved. This authenticity avoidance creates relationships that feel simultaneously intimate and lonely. You are close to another person, but not truly known by them. They love you, but they love the version of you that serves their psychological needs rather than the complete person you actually are. The protocol convinces you that this selective love is better than no love at all, that being appreciated for some of your qualities is preferable to risking rejection for all of them. But partial love creates partial aliveness. You cannot feel fully real when significant aspects of yourself must remain hidden to maintain another person's affection. Breaking free from the incompleteness protocol requires what I call wholeness archaeology, the painstaking work of excavating your authentic self from beneath the layers of programming that have taught you to see yourself as insufficient. This work cannot be done within relationship because relationship activates the very programs you are trying to dissolve. You must be willing to spend time alone, not just physically alone but psychologically alone, without the constant input and validation of others. You must learn to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing who you are when you are not performing a role for someone else's benefit. You must develop the capacity to generate your own sense of meaning, worth, and completeness. This process often involves what feels like a complete identity crisis. As you stop defining yourself in relationship to others, you may temporarily lose access to familiar sources of self-understanding. The person you thought you were may reveal itself to be a collection of responses designed to maintain other people's approval rather than an authentic expression of your essential nature. But this crisis is not a breakdown. It is a breakthrough. The confusion you experience is not evidence that you are lost. It is evidence that you are finally becoming found. The emptiness you feel is not absence but presence. The space where your authentic self has been waiting to emerge from beneath the layers of programmed responses. I worked with a woman who described this process as feeling like she was dissolving. After ending a long relationship that had defined her identity for years, she found herself unable to make simple decisions about what to eat, what to wear, how to spend her time. She had become so accustomed to defining herself in relationship to her partner's preferences that she had lost touch with her own. But as she learned to sit with this not knowing, to tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty about her own desires, something remarkable began to emerge. She started discovering preferences she had never noticed, interests she had never explored, capacities she had never developed. The dissolution she had feared was actually the melting away of a false self that had been constructed to maintain someone else's completion. This process of authentic self-discovery cannot be rushed or forced. It requires what I call patient presence, the willingness to be with yourself without immediately trying to fix, change, or improve what you find. You must learn to observe your own inner landscape with the same curiosity and compassion you might offer to a close friend. The incompleteness protocol will resist this self-discovery with every tool at its disposal. It will generate fear that you are becoming selfish, anxiety that you will end up alone, doubt that you are capable of independent happiness. But these fears are not prophetic. They are the death rattles of a system that has kept you imprisoned in patterns of dependency. As you develop genuine self-knowledge and self-acceptance, something extraordinary happens. You begin to feel complete not because you have acquired something new, but because you have stopped believing you were missing something essential. The wholeness you seek has been there all along, obscured by programming that taught you to look for it everywhere except where it actually exists. This completeness is not static or final. It is a living quality that continues to deepen and evolve throughout your life. But it is not dependent on anyone else's presence or approval for its reality. You become internally resourced, capable of generating your own sense of meaning, worth, and joy. When you operate from this foundation of genuine completeness, your capacity for authentic love is born. You can appreciate another person without needing them to complete you. You can share intimacy without losing yourself. You can commit to partnership without abandoning your individual growth. This is love freed from the incompleteness protocol. Not two halves seeking to become whole, but two whole beings choosing to create something together that neither could create alone. It is not merger, but communion. not dependency, but interdependence, not completion, but collaboration. But achieving this freedom requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands the practical work of deprogramming, the systematic identification and dissolution of the patterns that have kept you seeking externally for what can only be found within. This work is not comfortable, convenient, or quick. It requires dedication, patience, and the willingness to question everything you have been taught about love, relationships, and human nature itself. The programming will not surrender easily. It has invested too much in your dependency to release you without a fight. But every moment of authentic self-discovery weakens its hold. Every choice made from genuine preference rather than programmed response diminishes its power. Every experience of independent joy proves its fundamental lie. You are not incomplete. You never were. The emptiness you have tried to fill through relationship is not absence, but presence. The space where your authentic self has been waiting for you to stop searching elsewhere and finally come home. This homecoming is not the end of love, but its true beginning, the foundation upon which all genuine connection must be built. This homecoming is not the end of love, but its true beginning, the foundation upon which all genuine connection must be built. But the programming has one final card to play, one last algorithm so subtle and so profound that even those who have awakened to their own completeness can fall under its spell. I call this the transcendence trap, the belief that understanding love's programming somehow makes you immune to its influence. You begin to feel superior to those still caught in the cycles of programmed attachment. You observe their desperate searching, their codependent patterns, their inability to be alone, and you think you have evolved beyond such primitive responses. The programming has simply moved to a higher level, convincing you that intellectual understanding equals emotional freedom. But knowing how a trap works does not automatically free you from it. The neural pathways carved by years of programmed responses do not disappear because you have recognized their existence. The biochemical cascades triggered by attachment do not cease because you understand their evolutionary purpose. The unconscious patterns that drive your behavior toward connection continue operating beneath your conscious awareness, now disguised as enlightened choice. I worked with a therapist who had spent years studying attachment theory, who could articulate the mechanisms of codependency with clinical precision, who taught workshops on healthy relationships and emotional independence. Yet when her marriage ended after 15 years, she found herself engaging in behaviors that horrified her rational mind, checking her ex-husband's social media obsessively, driving past his new apartment, analyzing every text message for hidden meanings. Her intellectual understanding of love's programming had created a false sense of immunity that made her more vulnerable, not less. She had believed that knowledge was protection, that awareness was armor. But the programming operates in domains that intellect cannot reach, in the primal regions of the nervous system where understanding is irrelevant and only experience matters. This is the cruelest irony of love's programming. It can use your very attempts to understand it as fuel for its own perpetuation. Your insights become weapons turned against you. Your awareness becomes a prison more sophisticated than ignorance. You develop what I call meta-programming, patterns that operate at the level of your relationship to the patterns themselves. You may convince yourself that you are choosing to engage in obsessive thinking because it serves some higher purpose of processing or integration. You rationalize compulsive behaviors as necessary healing work. You interpret your inability to let go as evidence of your depth, your sensitivity, your refusal to become shallow or disconnected. The programming has learned to speak the language of spirituality, therapy, and personal growth. It dresses itself in the vocabulary of conscious relationship, soul connections, and divine timing. It transforms every symptom of addiction into evidence of spiritual evolution, every marker of dependency into proof of authentic love. I once encountered a woman who had been separated from her partner for 3 years, but continued to believe they were working through their issues on a soul level. She interpreted every synchronicity as a sign of their cosmic connection, every dream as a message about their ultimate reunion, every period of missing him as evidence of their spiritual bond. She had constructed an elaborate mythology that allowed her to remain attached while believing she was practicing detachment, to stay imprisoned while thinking she was free. The programming had hijacked her spiritual vocabulary so completely that she could no longer distinguish between authentic mystical experience and neurochemical withdrawal dressed in sacred clothing. This spiritual bypassing of love's programming is perhaps its most sophisticated form because it makes the person feel evolved while keeping them completely trapped. They speak of unconditional love while practicing conditional attachment. They claim to honor divine timing while refusing to accept present reality. They describe their obsession as devotion, their suffering as purification, their inability to move forward as evidence of their spiritual depth. But true spirituality does not require suffering for its validation. Authentic love does not demand the sacrifice of your present moment awareness for its proof. Genuine devotion does not ask you to remain frozen in patterns that prevent your continued evolution. The programming also creates what I call recovery relapse cycles. You may successfully free yourself from its influence for months or even years, developing genuine independence and authentic self-relationship. But then something triggers the old patterns, a song, a scent, a particular quality of light, and suddenly you are back in the grip of responses you thought you had transcended. These relapses can be devastating because they seem to prove that all your growth was illusory, that you are still as programmed as ever, that freedom was just another form of self-deception. But relapses are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of the programming's persistence and your need for continued vigilance. The neural pathways carved by deep attachment never fully disappear. They become dormant, waiting to be reactivated by the right stimulus. This is not a design flaw. It is an evolutionary feature that ensured our ancestors would remain bonded to partners even through periods of separation or conflict. But in the modern world, this feature often becomes a bug. The pathways designed to maintain life-sustaining bonds continue operating long after the relationship has become destructive or impossible. You find yourself biochemically loyal to people who have betrayed you, neurologically attached to connections that no longer serve your growth. Understanding this permanence of programming is both sobering and liberating. Sobering because it means you can never completely let your guard down, never assume you are beyond the reach of old patterns. Liberating because it explains why healing is not linear, why growth involves setbacks, Why freedom requires ongoing commitment rather than one-time achievement. The programming also evolves in response to your attempts to escape it. When you learn to recognize one pattern, it develops new variations that are harder to detect. When you build defenses against obvious manipulation, it learns to approach through subtler channels. When you become immune to dramatic expressions of attachment, it whispers through gentle nostalgia. I worked with a man who had successfully ended a toxic relationship and maintained no contact for 2 years. He had done extensive therapy, developed new interests, created a fulfilling single life. But then he received a simple text message on his birthday, just "Happy birthday, hope you're well," and found himself emotionally destabilized for weeks. The programming had learned that dramatic gestures would activate his defenses, so it approached through seemingly innocent contact that bypassed his conscious resistance. A few words were enough to reactivate pathways that had been dormant, flooding his system with familiar chemicals and triggering responses he thought he had overcome. This is why recovery from love's programming requires what I call dynamic vigilance. Not the rigid hypervigilance of trauma, but the flexible awareness of someone who understands they are living with a condition that requires ongoing management, like someone with a chronic illness who has learned to recognize early symptoms and take preventive action. The programming also creates what I call nostalgia hijacking, the process by which ordinary memories become weaponized against your present moment awareness. A song that once played during a happy moment becomes a trigger that can transport you instantly back to the emotional state of that memory, complete with all the biochemical responses that originally accompanied it. These nostalgia attacks can be so powerful that they make your current reality feel hollow by comparison. The edited highlights of your past relationship become more vivid and compelling than the actual experiences available to you in the present. You become a refugee from your own life, living in the exile of memory, while your actual existence passes by unnoticed. The programming edits these memories with the skill of a master filmmaker, cutting out the boring parts, the conflicts, the disappointments. What remains is a highlight reel so compelling that it makes everything else feel like a poor substitute. You are not remembering the relationship. You are remembering the neurochemical peak experiences while forgetting everything else. This selective editing serves the programming's agenda perfectly. If you remembered the relationship accurately, including its limitations and pain, you might be able to integrate the experience and move forward. But the programming cannot allow accurate memory because accurate memory might lead to genuine closure. Instead, it maintains a version of the past that is simultaneously more perfect and more painful than the actual experience ever was. You become haunted not by what actually happened, but by what your programmed memory has constructed. A ghost story written by algorithms that care nothing for your well-being. Breaking free from nostalgia. Hijacking requires what I call memory archaeology, the careful excavation of actual experience from beneath the layers of programmed editing. You must be willing to remember not just the peak moments, but the valleys, not just the connection, but the disconnection, not just how they made you feel at your best, but how they made you feel at your worst. This honest remembering is not an attack on what was beautiful in the relationship. It is not an attempt to diminish genuine love or connection. It is simply the restoration of accurate memory as the foundation for conscious choice. You cannot make healthy decisions about your future based on edited versions of your past. The programming resists this archaeological work because it knows that accurate memory leads to accurate assessment, and accurate assessment might reveal that what you are mourning was not as perfect as you have been programmed to believe. The beloved might be revealed as a complex human being with their own limitations rather than the idealized figure your algorithms have constructed. But this revelation is not loss, it is liberation. When you can see the relationship clearly, you can appreciate what was genuinely valuable without being imprisoned by what was limiting. You can honor what you shared without being unable to create something new. You can remember with gratitude rather than with the desperate longing that keeps you chained to the past. The programming also creates what I call future contamination, the inability to imagine meaningful possibilities that do not reference the lost connection. Every potential experience becomes measured against the template of what you shared with them. Every possible joy is diminished by their absence from it. Every conceivable future feels incomplete without their participation. This contamination can persist for years, creating a life lived in the shadow of what was lost. You may achieve external success, develop new relationships, create meaningful experiences, but everything feels somehow provisional, temporary, less significant than what you had with the person who established the original template. I encountered a musician whose creative life had been so thoroughly contaminated by the memory of a lost love that he could no longer compose without referencing their shared aesthetic. Every melody reminded him of songs they had listened to together. Every lyric seemed to address their absent presence. His artistic expression had become a form of unconscious communication with someone who was no longer available to receive it. He was not creating music, he was creating monuments to his programming, artistic expressions of his inability to imagine beauty that did not reference what he had lost. His creativity had been colonized by algorithms that interpreted every act of creation as either a message to the absent beloved or a pale imitation of what they might have created together. The programming had convinced him that moving beyond their shared aesthetic would be a betrayal of what was most authentic in his artistic expression. But what felt like authenticity was actually programming disguised as artistic integrity. He was not honoring his creativity. He was imprisoning it within the boundaries of a relationship that no longer existed. Breaking free from future contamination requires what I call imaginative sovereignty, the reclamation of your right to envision possibilities that do not reference past attachments. This is not about forgetting what was meaningful in previous connections, but about refusing to let those memories colonize your capacity to imagine new forms of meaning. The programming will resist this imaginative liberation with every tool at its disposal. It will generate guilt for wanting experiences that do not include them, shame for finding excitement in possibilities they will never share, fear that moving forward means you never really loved them. But these responses are not coming from authentic love. They are coming from systems designed to keep you psychologically indentured to someone who has chosen to be free. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of love's programming is how it creates what I call suffering sanctification, the transformation of pain into virtue, of obsession into devotion, of inability to let go into evidence of spiritual depth. The programming convinces you that your suffering proves something noble about your character, that your inability to move on demonstrates your capacity for real love, that your persistent hope shows your faith in transcendent connection. But suffering is not virtue, obsession is not devotion. The inability to let go is not spiritual depth. These are symptoms of programming that has learned to disguise itself as nobility to avoid examination. The programming benefits from your belief that your pain serves some higher purpose because such belief makes you willing to endure indefinitely what you might otherwise question. I worked with a man who had spent 7 years mourning a relationship that had lasted only 8 months. He described his persistent grief as evidence of his capacity for deep love, his inability to date others as proof of his loyalty, his continued hope for reunion as faith in the power of true connection. But when we examined the actual dynamics of the original relationship, what emerged was not a great love story, but a brief encounter with someone who had activated his deepest abandonment wounds. His persistent attachment was not devotion, it was trauma repetition disguised as romantic virtue. The programming had convinced him that the intensity of his response proved the significance of the connection. But intensity is not significance. Pain is not proof of love. The depth of your wound does not correlate with the value of what wounded you. His 7 years of suffering had served no purpose except to feed the algorithms that kept him imprisoned in patterns established by his earliest experiences of loss and abandonment. He was not honoring love, he was honoring programming that had learned to speak the language of love to avoid detection. The programming also creates what I call healing resistance, the unconscious sabotage of your own recovery efforts. Part of you wants to be free from the patterns that cause you pain, but another part recognizes that freedom would require giving up the identity you have built around your attachment to unavailable love. If you are no longer the person who loves deeply and suffers beautifully, who are you? If you are not carrying the torch for lost love, what is your purpose? If you are not waiting faithfully for someone who may never return, what gives your life meaning? The programming has made your suffering so central to your identity that releasing it feels like death. This resistance manifests in subtle ways. You may forget to take actions that would support your healing. You may find excuses to avoid therapy or support groups. You may unconsciously seek out triggers that reactivate your attachment patterns. You may interpret progress as evidence that you are betraying your authentic feelings. I encountered a woman who had been working diligently on recovering from a devastating breakup. She attended therapy, practiced meditation, developed new friendships, pursued creative interests. But every time she began to feel genuinely happy, she would find ways to reconnect with memories of her lost love, as if happiness without reference to that relationship felt somehow false. She had unconsciously organized her identity around being the kind of person who loved so deeply that she could not fully recover from its loss. Healing threatened this identity, which felt more real and valuable than the possibility of moving forward. She preferred noble suffering to ordinary happiness because suffering had become her claim to specialness. The programming had convinced her that her pain was sacred, that her inability to let go proved her superiority to people who moved on easily from failed relationships. She had built a spiritual mythology around her suffering that made recovery feel like spiritual regression rather than growth. But there is nothing sacred about remaining imprisoned by patterns that prevent your evolution. There is nothing noble about refusing to learn from experience. There is nothing spiritually advanced about choosing familiar pain over unfamiliar joy. The programming also creates what I call redemption fantasies. elaborate scenarios in which your suffering is eventually vindicated by the return of the beloved, the recognition of your worth, the acknowledgement of what they lost when they chose to leave. These fantasies provide just enough hope to keep you invested in patterns that serve no purpose except their own perpetuation. You imagine them realizing their mistake, recognizing your value, returning to claim the love they were too blind to appreciate. You construct detailed scenarios of reunion, reconciliation, and vindication. These fantasies feel like hope, but they are actually sophisticated forms of denial that prevent you from accepting present reality. The programming feeds these fantasies because they serve its agenda perfectly. As long as you believe reunion is possible, you will remain psychologically available. As long as you invest in redemption scenarios, you will avoid the work of building a life that does not depend on their participation. I worked with a woman who had maintained elaborate reunion fantasies for 5 years after her husband left her for another woman. She imagined his new relationship failing, his recognition of what he had thrown away, his desperate attempt to win her back. These fantasies were so detailed and compelling that they felt more real than her actual life. She made decisions based on these imagined futures, keeping herself available, maintaining hope, refusing to fully invest in new possibilities. The fantasies had become a parallel reality that prevented her from inhabiting the one actually available to her. But fantasies are not prophecies. Hope is not planning. The elaborate scenarios your mind constructs to avoid accepting loss are not visions of the future. They are symptoms of programming that cannot tolerate the finality of endings. The beloved in your redemption fantasies is not the actual person who chose to leave. It is a programmed construction designed to keep you attached to patterns that no longer serve your growth. You are not hoping for their return. You are hoping to avoid the work of creating a life that does not require their validation for its meaning. Breaking free from redemption fantasies requires what I call reality alignment. The conscious choice to base your decisions on what is actually happening rather than what you wish might happen. This does not mean becoming cynical or closed-hearted. It means distinguishing between authentic hope and programmed denial. Authentic hope is based on present possibilities and your own capacity for growth and creation. Programmed hope is based on the fantasy that external circumstances will change in ways that allow you to avoid the work of internal transformation. One empowers you, the other imprisons you. The programming also creates what I call comparative imprisonment, the compulsive measurement of every new experience against the template established by the lost relationship. No present joy can match the edited highlights of past connection. No current partner can compete with the idealized version of someone who exists now only in memory. This comparison trap ensures that nothing in your present life feels adequate. Every new person you meet is found wanting when measured against someone who has been perfected by absence. Every potential relationship is sabotaged by standards based not on compatibility, but on the neurochemical signature of a connection that may have been dysfunctional even when it existed. I encountered a man who had been single for 6 years, not from lack of opportunity, but from his inability to stop comparing every potential partner to his ex-wife. He would meet interesting, attractive, compatible women and find himself cataloguing all the ways they differed from the woman who had left him for someone else. She had been spontaneous. These women were too planned. She had been artistic. These women were too practical. She had been passionate. These women were too calm. He had created an impossible standard based not on what had actually made their relationship successful. It had failed after all, but on the qualities he missed most about her presence in his life. The programming had convinced him that his inability to connect with new people proved the uniqueness of what he had lost. But what it actually proved was that he was seeking to recreate a neurochemical experience rather than discover what authentic compatibility might feel like when freed from the need to replicate familiar patterns. He was not looking for love. He was looking for a drug that could provide the same high as his original addiction. Every woman who failed to trigger his trauma responses felt boring by comparison because he had confused intensity with intimacy, familiarity with compatibility, the activation of old wounds with the recognition of true connection. The programming also creates what I call identity foreclosure, the premature conclusion that you are not the kind of person who can love again, move on, or find happiness with someone new. You interpret your difficulty letting go as evidence of your nature rather than recognizing it as the result of programming that can be changed. This identity foreclosure serves the programming perfectly because it transforms temporary symptoms into permanent characteristics. Instead of seeing your attachment patterns as conditioned responses that can be modified, you see them as essential aspects of your personality that must be accepted and accommodated. You begin to describe yourself as someone who loves too deeply, who never gets over people, who just isn't good at casual relationships. These descriptions feel like self-knowledge, but they are actually self-imprisonment, the transformation of programmed responses into fixed identity that justifies continued suffering. I worked with a woman who had concluded that she was simply too sensitive for modern dating, that her need for deep connection made her incompatible with a world of casual encounters and superficial relationships. She had turned her difficulty forming new attachments into evidence of her spiritual superiority rather than recognizing it as the result of programming that made genuine intimacy impossible. Her sensitivity was actually hypervigilance developed in response to early abandonment experiences. Her need for deep connection was actually a compulsive search for someone who could provide the security she had never learned to generate internally. Her supposed incompatibility with casual relationships was actually an inability to be present with people who did not trigger her familiar patterns of anxiety and pursuit. But she had organized her entire identity around these programmed responses, turning symptoms into virtues and dysfunction into spiritual gifts. The programming had convinced her that changing these patterns would mean betraying her authentic nature, rather than recognizing that her authentic nature was buried beneath layers of conditioned responses. Identity foreclosure prevents growth by making programming feel like personality. It stops you from questioning patterns that cause you pain, because questioning them feels like questioning who you are. But you are not your programming. Your conditioned responses are not your essential nature. Your current limitations are not your permanent characteristics. The programming also creates what I call healing timeline anxiety, the compulsive comparison of your recovery process to external standards or other people's experiences. You begin to worry that you are taking too long to get over someone, that your grief is excessive, that your inability to move on proves something is wrong with you. This anxiety serves the programming by creating additional stress that actually slows the healing process. When you are anxious about your anxiety, depressed about your depression, ashamed of your inability to let go, you create secondary layers of suffering that make recovery more difficult. The programming benefits from this anxiety because it keeps you focused on your supposed failure to heal rather than on the actual work of healing. You become more concerned with appearing recovered than with doing the internal work that would lead to genuine recovery. I encountered a man who had become so focused on his timeline for getting over his divorce that he had turned healing into a performance. He tracked his progress obsessively, comparing his emotional state to where he thought he should be at various intervals, interpreting every setback as evidence of his failure to recover properly. This focus on timeline had actually prevented him from doing the deeper work of understanding why the divorce had been so devastating, what patterns in himself had contributed to the relationship's failure, what internal resources he needed to develop to create healthier connections in the future. He was trying to heal from the outside in, managing symptoms rather than addressing causes, focusing on appearing better rather than becoming whole. The programming had convinced him that recovery was about reaching a destination rather than engaging in a process, about achieving a state rather than developing capacities. But healing is not linear. Recovery does not follow predictable timelines. Growth happens in spirals rather than straight lines. The programming wants you to believe that healing should be efficient, measurable, and comparable to other people's experiences, because such beliefs keep you focused on external standards rather than internal reality. The deepest work of recovering from love's programming is not about getting over someone. It is about getting under your own patterns, understanding the conditioning that made you vulnerable to programming in the first place, developing the internal resources that would make you less susceptible to its influence in the future. This work requires what I call archaeological patience, the willingness to excavate your conditioning layer by layer, to examine each pattern with curiosity rather than judgment, to understand how your current responses were shaped by experiences you may not even remember consciously. The programming that governs your adult relationships was often installed in early childhood, long before romantic love entered your life. The patterns that make you seek completion in others, that make you interpret love as suffering, that make you confuse intensity with intimacy. These were learned responses to early experiences of dependency, abandonment, and conditional love. Understanding this developmental origin of your programming is not about blaming your parents or dwelling in victimhood. It is about recognizing that your current responses made sense given your early circumstances, that they were adaptive strategies developed by a child trying to survive in conditions that required such adaptations. But what was adaptive in childhood may be destructive in adulthood. The strategies that helped you navigate early relationships may sabotage your capacity for mature love. The patterns that ensured survival may prevent thriving. This is why recovery from love's programming often feels like growing up all over again, because in many ways, you are. You are learning to relate from adult consciousness rather than childhood conditioning, to choose responses rather than enact reactions, to love from wholeness rather than neediness. The programming will resist this maturation process because mature love is much harder to manipulate than programmed attachment. When you love from completeness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion, from awareness rather than unconsciousness, you become a much less reliable source of the energy that feeds dysfunctional patterns. This resistance manifests as nostalgia for the intensity of programmed love. Healthy relationships may initially feel boring compared to the drama of dysfunction. Compatible partners may seem less exciting than those who activate your trauma responses. Growth may feel like loss because you are losing access to familiar forms of suffering that had become central to your identity. But this boredom is not evidence that healthy love is inferior. It is evidence that you have been conditioned to mistake chaos for passion, uncertainty for excitement, anxiety for aliveness. Learning to appreciate the quieter satisfactions of authentic connection requires developing new capacities for presence, gratitude, and joy. The programming also creates what I call enlightenment bypassing, the belief that spiritual understanding should automatically free you from psychological conditioning. You may study non-dual philosophy, practice meditation, develop mystical experiences, and assume that such spiritual development makes you immune to the primitive patterns that govern human attachment. But spirituality and psychology operate in different domains. You can have profound mystical experiences while still being driven by unconscious patterns in your relationships. You can understand the illusory nature of the separate self while still being programmed to seek completion through others. I worked with a meditation teacher who had spent decades developing extraordinary states of consciousness, but found himself completely destabilized by the end of a romantic relationship. His spiritual practice had given him access to experiences of unity and transcendence, but it had not addressed the early conditioning that made him vulnerable to attachment programming. He was confused and ashamed by the intensity of his responses because he believed his spiritual development should have made him immune to such lower concerns. But the programming that governs attachment operates in domains that transcendent experiences cannot touch, in the nervous system, in cellular memory, in patterns established before language developed. Authentic spiritual development includes, rather than bypasses, psychological healing. It recognizes that consciousness exists at multiple levels and that integration requires work at all levels, not just the transcendent ones. True enlightenment includes the capacity for healthy human relationships, not the transcendence of relationship altogether. The programming also creates what I call wisdom resistance, the unconscious rejection of insights that might threaten its continued operation. You may read books about healthy relationships, attend therapy sessions, have conversations with wise friends, but find yourself unable to integrate the information that could free you from your patterns. The programming acts like an immune system, rejecting foreign wisdom that might disrupt its familiar operations. This resistance often manifests as intellectual understanding without emotional integration. You can articulate sophisticated concepts about codependency, attachment styles, and trauma bonding while continuing to enact the very patterns you can describe so eloquently. The programming allows you to possess the knowledge as long as you do not apply it in ways that would threaten its influence. I encountered a psychology professor who specialized in relationship research but found herself repeatedly attracted to emotionally unavailable men. She could lecture brilliantly about secure attachment, analyze the dynamics of anxious avoidant pairing, and counsel students struggling with similar patterns. But when it came to her own romantic choices, all her expertise seemed to vanish. The programming had learned to compartmentalize her professional knowledge, keeping it safely quarantined from the domains where it might actually threaten the familiar patterns that governed her personal life. She could study love objectively while remaining completely subjugated to its programming in her intimate relationships. This compartmentalization serves the programming's survival strategy. It allows you to feel educated and self-aware while keeping you trapped in the very patterns you have studied so thoroughly. Knowledge becomes a form of sophisticated denial rather than a tool for liberation. Breaking through wisdom resistance requires what I call embodied integration, the movement of insight from the intellectual level into the cellular, emotional, and behavioral domains where programming actually operates. This integration cannot be forced or rushed. It requires patience, practice, and the willingness to feel your way into new responses rather than simply thinking your way out of old ones. The programming also creates what I call recovery sabotage, the unconscious undermining of your own healing efforts when they become too effective. Just as you begin to feel genuinely free from old patterns, to experience authentic joy that does not reference past attachments, to imagine futures that do not require someone else's validation, something inside you creates circumstances that pull you back into familiar suffering. You may find yourself reaching out to your ex just as you were starting to let go. You may seek out triggers that reactivate dormant attachment patterns. You may interpret your growing independence as evidence that you are becoming cold or disconnected. The programming recognizes that genuine healing threatens its existence and mobilizes every resource to prevent your complete liberation. This sabotage is particularly cruel because it often occurs at moments when freedom feels closest. Just as you begin to taste the possibilities that await beyond your conditioned responses, the programming reasserts its influence with renewed intensity. Many people interpret these setbacks as evidence that healing is impossible, that they are doomed to repeat familiar patterns forever. But these sabotage episodes are actually evidence that healing is working. The programming only fights back when it feels genuinely threatened. The intensity of the resistance often corresponds to the proximity of breakthrough. What feels like regression may actually be the final struggle of a system that senses its impending dissolution. I worked with a woman who had spent 2 years recovering from a traumatic relationship, developing healthy friendships, pursuing creative interests, building a life that felt meaningful and complete. But as she approached the second anniversary of her breakup, a symbolic milestone that represented full recovery in her mind, she found herself overwhelmed by sudden longing for her abusive ex-partner. She began questioning whether she had really healed at all, whether her growth was genuine or just sophisticated denial. The programming had waited until she felt most confident in her recovery to launch its most intensive counterattack, knowing that doubt at this stage would be particularly devastating. But this resurgence of longing was not evidence of failed healing. It was the programming's death rattle, its final attempt to reassert control over a system that had been increasingly liberated from its influence. The intensity of the response was proportional to the threat the programming perceived, not to the reality of her regression. Understanding this dynamic helps you interpret apparent setbacks as progress markers rather than failure indicators. When old patterns resurface with particular intensity, it often means you are closer to freedom than you realize. The programming's desperation is evidence of its weakening grip, not its renewed strength. The programming also creates what I call freedom phobia, the terror of actually becoming free from the patterns that have defined your emotional life for so long. Even when you recognize that your programming causes suffering, the prospect of existing without it can feel more frightening than continuing to endure its influence. Who would you be without the drama of unavailable love? What would give your life meaning if you were not carrying the torch for lost connection? How would you know you were capable of deep feeling if you were not suffering beautifully for someone who cannot appreciate your devotion?